There are two parts to this module. First, it addresses some of the time-dependent actions that need to be reinforced, such as undertaking oil trajectory analysis and aerial observations, preparing an initial SCAT plan, and responding to the transition oil before it strands. The second part pertains to SCAT-specific positions, such as a coordinator, team lead or leader, and data manager, and their core tasks and skills. The module further differentiates those that are the primary SCAT doing most of the technical work, the heavy lifting, from those that are representative SCATs, the oversight. These tasks and interests can overlap. Lastly, there are some common scientific disciplines that can often be part of the SCAT field team, such as a coastal geomorphologist, a biologist, and an archaeologist. This module takes about 30 minutes to complete.
It is important to garner a common operational picture of where released oil has traveled, where it's collected, and its weathering state. The sooner the better. This is the mission of an aerial observer at the onset of a spill. As a SCAT member, you're either one of these observers or you're relying on the information provided by others. Coastal aerial observation of oil trajectory and identification is an entirely specialized field in its own. It is not covered in this SCAT course other than addressing the benefits and its application. A very time-dependent observation is locating oil trapped along shoreline crevices, channels, and behind reefs, commonly referred to as the shore zone. You're looking for gross amounts of oil. This is the cheap oil to recover compared to stranded on shores. The challenge is to shift open water tactics from booms and skimmers to different tactics that can entail a swarm of smaller vessels and manually scooping up this oil. Operations is directed to use maps with shoreline unit numbers on it rather than nautical charts. As oil trapped along and within the shore zone is linked to shoreline units, it's the SCAT role to assess. The dependent issue is whether oil may become covered by sediments, such as sand, owing to a changing beach profile caused by a storm event. It can happen fast. Even a centimeter sediment over oil now makes finding the oil difficult. It greatly increases treatment costs and oily wastes. As emphasized several times, it's important for SCAT to get ahead of operations and then to guide them. One of the ways is to develop a generic shoreline treatment plan. This generic plan is based on computer-based oil spill trajectory analysis followed by aerial observations to help paint the big picture to capture unified command and operations attention towards establishing a shore protection program that includes SCAT. This helps operations and logistics to determine how many SCAT teams may be required and scope out the size of a shoreline workforce. This may occur while operations are still very much engaged in open water oil recovery. There could be opportunities to start shore treatments on specific shores that are easy to get at, that are straightforward, and no more re-oiling will occur. Timely, visible engagement on oil shores help garner public attention to efforts being done to clean them. The shore treatment plan accompanies the incident action plan that is reviewed by Unified Command and approved. It should focus on the specifics of the incident and not be educational nor instructional. Nobody has time to read long documents. This video shows an oil spill trajectory analysis to determine where oil most likely will reach shores, either to be trapped along it or strand. It depicts the highest levels of concentrations. The combination of the high altitude reconnaissance flights and the low and slow field surveys along the shores by helicopters provide a much accurate picture and understanding of what's truly happening. Though a specialized task, it's important to understand the difference between a reconnaissance versus field level of area observations for shoreline assessments. The former is open water, fast and high altitude overflights, while oil is still floating, spreading. Incident management may not have been established yet, still in the initial response phase. In contrast, a field survey is closer to shore, and most, if not all, the oil is no longer floating offshore, but near or stranded onshore within the shore zone. This work can be done from a vessel or a vehicle as well. The environmental unit will be established at this phase, and SCAT will be working along the schedules, meetings, and deliverables of the operational period. Shore-based field observations by aircraft are reserved for more widespread spills. Working from a helicopter is a specialized function that has its own safety and technical challenges and components that are beyond this course. It can be a challenge to shift operations from their attention to on-water oil recovery to shoreline operations, particularly the oil trapped within the shore zone. This is the last opportunity to get this mobile oil before it strands on shore and becomes a protracted work effort that is expensive, laborious, often unsafe, and can result in additional environmental impact. There is a transition from offshore area reconnaissance to shore-based field surveys that requires different technologies, mapping, peoples, and processes. Again, this is advanced training as a technical specialist in area observation. We're finished with the time-dependent challenges, and now we're going to look at SCAT jobs. These are typically people who are going to be occupying the environmental unit within the incident command post, as well as going out in the field as a SCAT member. The positions generally consist of a coordinator, data manager, and logistics person located in this command post, as well as a team lead working in the field with the responsible party, agencies, First Nations or indigenous tribal members, as well as other representatives. SCAT management, which may be part of a shoreline response program, is generally undertaken in the environmental unit. This is because SCAT members' expertise, local knowledge, and science incorporates those concepts as low as reasonable practicable, net environmental benefit, leading to best management practices. These are integrated with environmental unit's mission to recognize and incorporate coastal values, resources, vulnerabilities, and sensitivities into incident management decisions. SCAT management is organized as a working group. The organization chart shows the key positions and their functions. We will look at these positions a little bit more closely. The SCAT coordinator is typically the most qualified and experienced person in the team. This person has spent their career doing SCAT and keeping abreast of the evolving protocols, forms, and technologies. It is a high-profile, demanding position. For large incidences, the coordinator may have a SCAT program manager to help him or her out, so that the coordinator can focus on the strategic needs and communication rather than the minutiae of program delivery. The SCAT coordinator reports directly to the environmental unit leader as part of the ICS chain of command. As important, the SCAT coordinator establishes an informal communications with operations section, particularly the division supervisors and branch directors engaged in shoreline operations. The coordinator is often the spokesperson on SCAT activities and participates in scheduled briefings for command, tactics, and planning according to the operational period. Check out the tasks of the SCAT coordinator's core duties to coordinate, liaise, and communicate. The SCAT coordinator is typically hired by the responsible party, but not necessarily. The coordinator would be a consultant or contractor. Hiring by the responsible party reflects the polluter play principle. That doesn't mean the SCAT coordinator actually represents the responsible party. He or she is tasked to run the program. Nevertheless, there will be an interest on the part of the responsible party to ensure that all treatment measures, if required, are as low as reasonable practical, such as being pragmatic, feasible, and of reasonable cost. The SCAT coordinator has much more than just a technical job. It has a leadership role that sets the tone, pace, and direction of the whole SCAT program. It requires a lot of interpersonal skills to help, motivate, brief, engage, evaluate, and recommend aspects of the SCAT mission. Take a look at the leadership circle that highlights SCAT leadership attributes. There is a timeless tactical truth that without logistics you can't have tactics. This also applies to undertaking SCAT field work. You have to have ways and means to get people out into the field. Getting SCAT team members into the field is a bit of an interplay of either doing it internally within an environmental unit or working within the command system's logistics section. It's somewhat dependent on the complexity and the size of a marine oil spill. For a large marine oil spill, it's important to have a person located in this command post to coordinate and track daily assignments of the SCAT field teams to ensure they have the appropriate transportation and safety equipment. That's the role of SCAT Logistics, who works closely with the Incident Management Safety Officer and Logistics section, particularly air operations, as helicopters become a very important resource for SCAT. When working in a division, you sometimes have the opportunity to catch a ride with one of the response vessels. Locally based vessels, such as those owned and managed by a coastal First Nation, can provide a valuable service for SCAT transportation. These vessels are designed for the working environment, the rain, fog, and seas, with operators familiar with the area regarding navigation and safety. The SCAT coordinator sorts out these details, whether they are dedicated resources or opportunistic ones. The SCAT data manager is a rare breed. There are a few of them and they're hard to find. This is a demanding job because there is a high demand for consolidated and correlated SCAT information into maps, charts, and graphic formats, such as for each shore oiling levels, and then status reports on each shore's assessed, needing treatment, and reaching endpoints. There's even more to the job. Images taken in the field have to be correlated, waypoints and handheld GPS data downloaded, data from shore oiling summary forms have to be captured and correlated and put into an electronic database for analysis. It's a SCAT manager's product that helps track and guides SCAT operations in the field of what's being done, what needs to be done, and when work is over. It's important that SCAT field members are in sync with the data manager when presenting their work to him or her, and recognize the data manager often has time-dependent and time-sensitive deliverables. A SCAT team lead or leader must have a minimum requirement of advanced SCAT training and some oil spill experience. The SCAT lead is the boots on the ground and guides field assessments one shore at a time, which includes the technical aspects of measuring stranded oil, as well as the institutional matters pertaining to collaborations and representation regarding harm, coastal values, and cleanup expectations. These are two different skill sets, but very important. Take a look at the graphics. The inner circle represents the technical skills, where the outer circles are the social ones. There can be several SCAT leads depending on the size and scope of the spill. The SCAT team lead has lots of tasks to do. They are accomplished by his or her training and skills, as well as collaboration with other members of the SCAT field team. The SCAT team lead is responsible to ensure that all the tasks are fully done and are complete and accurate. Often you only get one chance to go back to that shoreline segment to assess it. As well, the logistics of getting there in the first place was expensive and difficult, so you got to get it right first, and that's the role of the SCAT lead. It's the SCAT lead that interfaces with the division supervisor or the workforce or task force leaders who are overseeing the actual people doing the cleanup work, as well as any public that may show up on the beach and wants to know what's going on. The SCAT Op liaison person has already been briefly examined. This person requires some short treatment or operational experience and well trained in SCAT. On a large incident, the SCAT Ops liaison ensures that all aspects of operations and its supervisors and workforce leaders understands the treatment, the endpoints, and the constraints provided in a shoreline treatment recommendation form. That is their work assignment. Though STRs are supposed to be kept simple, some of them get to be very long and quite complex. Sometimes an STR requires interpretation based on unforeseen situations on the shore, or trying to determine when is an endpoint actually reached. Any questions and concerns can be addressed and resolved directly in the field. The more substantive ones are returned back to the environmental unit and the command post to address. As such, SCAT Operation Liaison ensures a two-way communication. It's important to understand who represent the interests of a particular oiled shore that is undergoing a field assessment under the guidance of a SCAT team lead. Representatives can attend and participate in the SCAT work. The greater the SCAT training and experience, the better they contribute. Representatives can be government agencies that have an environmental or ecology mandate. They can be of First Nations, or otherwise known as indigenous or tribal. Representatives address the interests of other stakeholders, such as the upland land users or a coastal community and the tourism, fisheries and agriculture and recreation. It is important to differentiate between a representative and stakeholder. Don't lump the two together. Representatives have provided authority to represent their jurisdiction and government residing in unified command on behalf of these stakeholders or an agency's mandate. Though SCAT may have some specific titles like lead and coordinator and liaison, there are certain disciplines that are generally sought out to be part of the field SCAT. It's not mandated that such disciplines are required. It's just that such disciplines can provide the science and knowledge that's required for SCAT field assessments. Let's begin with the coastal geomorphologist. The focus of the geomorphologist is on the physical aspects of the shoreline and oiling conditions. A coastal geomorphologist understands the sediments, its movements with exposure to waves, such as changes to a sediment shore's profile between winter and summer, or the longitudinal movement of sediments from wave actions that can cover oil. This person works mainly in the mid and upper intertidal zones, and is often the SCAT lead, taking on the task listed. A marine or coastal biologist helps assess the vulnerability and sensitivity of oil on the flora and fauna of shores. The biologist also assesses operational impacts, such as disturbances to shellfish beds, or the staging equipment in ecologically sensitive areas in the uplands. They draft the operational constraints that go into the shoreline treatment recommendation forms, telling operations what not to do, so as not to cause any more harm than the oil itself, so as to ensure a net environmental benefit is achieved. The biologist tends to work in the intertidal zone, undertaking the task listed. The focus of the archaeologist is on cultural and human use aspects of an oiled shore. The archaeologist must have a good eye to predict where operations might cause harm to cultural and historical sites and artifacts. These can include the more obvious fish weirs, clam gardens, village sites and middens, and petroglyphs, and burial caves. They can include ancient tools that are embedded in sediments that appear during operations cleanup activities. The archaeologist works very closely with coastal indigenous governments, as most of the sites and resources are documented and mapped in confidence on a First Nations geographic information system. Often the archaeologist or the consulting company has done work with the First Nations, so is trusted with their cultural and historical information. The archaeologist also establishes operation constraints that appear within the shore treatment recommendation form, such as not disturbing middens or staging equipment on village sites. The archaeologist may be tasked with completing the cultural resource evaluation and human use summary forms. This person can usually be found working in the backshore and fringe area of an oiled shore being assessed. The initial aerial reconnaissance and subsequent field surveys generally determines the scale of the SCAT management and its teams. The number of teams, the personnel qualifications, the logistics, and more should be reflected in the initial SCAT shoreline plan. A SCAT systematic survey program needs only to be 2 or 3 days in advance of shore-based operations, but not too far in advance of the operations if changing oil conditions are resulting, such as a storm event where sediments have covered stranded oil. Then you have to go back to reassess. A single SCAT field team may be sufficient for a small, localized spill. Oil shores can be surveyed in a day. In contrast, for a large, complex marine spill, such as in a remote location, there may be 4 to 6 SCAT teams established. An indicator that scale is correct is that SCAT is staying ahead of operations, and there's no bottlenecks in gathering and compiling field data for operations and incident command. The last thing you want is operations standing around waiting for their treatment instructions at thousands of dollars an hour